In the late summer of 1986, the air in Cleveland carried a heavy, humid weight that seemed to press against the brick buildings and the steel frames of cities searching for a new identity. At that time, the people of Northeast Ohio felt a quiet but persistent need to prove that their home was more than just an industrial hub or a punchline for late-night comedians who called it the mistake on the lake. They wanted something grand and something ethereal to lift the collective spirit of the community toward the vast blue horizon that stretched over the shimmering waters of Lake Erie. The plan was simple yet impossibly complex, involving the inflation of 1.5 million helium balloons that would be gathered under a massive mesh net in the center of Public Square. As the sun began to set on the days leading up to the event, thousands of volunteers gathered with small canisters of helium and bags of latex in every color of the rainbow, including cherry red and sunshine, yellow and deep royal blue and vibrant orange. The sound of the city was replaced by a rhythmic hiss of gas entering thin rubber membranes, followed by the soft click of plastic valves being tied shut. Imagine the repetitive motion of hands moving back and forth, as if weaving a giant multicolored tapestry that breathed and shifted with every slight breeze that drifted off the lake. There was a meditative quality to the work, as people from all walks of life sat side by side sharing stories in low tones, while the pile of balloons grew higher and higher, like a soft mountain of bubbles trapped under a giant web. The city lights twinkled in the distance, reflecting off the glass windows of the terminal tower, which stood like a silent sentinel watching over the preparations. The air was filled with a faint, sweet scent of talcum powder used to keep the balloons from sticking together, and the atmosphere was one of quiet anticipation rather than frantic energy. As the hours ticked toward dawn, the mountain of balloons began to pulse and sway, as if it were a living creature dreaming of the sky. The volunteers moved with a slow and steady pace, their shadows stretching long across the pavement under the amber glow of the street lamps. There was no rush, only the steady flow of breath and helium and the gentle rustle of latex against latex, which sounded like the softest rain falling on a forest floor. The goal was a world record, but the process was a lesson in patience and unity as the city prepared to exhale a cloud of color that would surely be remembered for generations. As the morning mist began to roll in from the water, the sky turned a pale shade of lavender, and the birds began their early chatter in the trees of the square. The massive net held firm, straining slightly against the collective buoyancy of a million tiny hopes, all tugging upward toward the heavens. The spectators began to arrive in small groups, carrying blankets and thermoses of coffee, their voices hushed by the sheer scale of the spectacle before them. It was a moment of transition for the city, a bridge between the gritty ironclad past and a future that felt as light as air. The wind was still, and the world felt balanced on the edge of a great sigh as the countdown drew near. Every person standing in that square felt a sense of belonging to something larger than themselves, as if the very atoms of the city were aligning for a single beautiful breath. The colors under the net were so dense they seemed to glow with an internal light, creating a stained glass effect that painted the faces of the crowd in hues of emerald and sapphire and gold. The steady hum of the city began to rise, but it was muffled by the soft presence of balloons, which acted like a giant silencer for the usual urban clamor. The water of the lake was a flat mirror reflecting the brightening sky, and the distant call of a freighter horn was the only sound that broke the stillness of the dawn. As the final preparations were made, the volunteers stepped back, wiping their brows and looking up at the magnificent shivering mass they had created through hours of silent labor. It was a testament to the power of a shared vision and the simple beauty of a dream made manifest in rubber and gas. The city of Cleveland was no longer a place of rust and smoke, but a stage for a miracle of color and light that promised to wash away the gray memories of years gone by. As the first ray of golden sunlight hit the top of the terminal tower, the entire square seemed to shimmer with a quiet electricity that was both calming and profound. The moment of release was approaching, but there was no sense of urgency, only a deep and peaceful readiness to let go and watch as the spirit of the city took flight on a billion molecules of helium. The world seemed to slow down until every heartbeat was synchronized with the gentle swaying of the net and the soft whistling of the wind through the nearby alleyways. The story of the balloons was a story of a city finding its voice in the silence of a rising sun, and as the net finally began to slacken, the air was filled with a sense of profound grace that whispered of new beginnings and the endless possibilities of the open sky. The colors began to swirl and mix as the first few balloons found their way through the gaps and the mesh rising like bubbles in a calm sea of air. The crowd watched in total silence, their eyes following the slow ascent of the scouts. toward the clouds, and for a brief moment time stood sensationally still, as if the earth itself had paused to watch the beauty of the city letting go of its burdens and rising toward the light. The silence was a blanket that covered the streets and the buildings and the hearts of everyone present, creating a sanctuary of peace in the middle of a busy world. The balloons moved with a rhythmic grace, bobbing and weaving as they climbed higher and higher, leaving the shadows of the buildings behind and entering the pure warmth of the morning sun. It was a sea of tranquility that stretched as far as the eye could see, a silent parade of dreams drifting on the currents of the atmosphere. As the sun climbed higher, the colors became even more vivid, turning the sky into a living painting that shifted and changed with every passing second. The experience was a lullaby for the senses, a visual melody that played across the vast expanse of the horizon and brought a sense of calm to the bustling city. Below, the balloons were a reminder that even the heaviest hearts can find lightness, and that the most industrial landscapes can be transformed by a single moment of shared beauty and quiet reflection. The city breathed in the cool lake air and exhaled a rainbow of hope that lingered in the mind long after balloons had vanished into the blue. It was a day of soft edges and blurred lines, where the reality of the ground met the infinite peace of the sky in a perfect harmony of color and light. The memory of that morning remains like a gentle echo in the streets of Cleveland, a story told in hushed tones to children as they drift off to sleep, dreaming of a sky filled with a million floating stars. The evening began with a low and steady hum as the massive woven net was unfurled across the stone expanse of Public Square in the heart of downtown Cleveland, where the air was thick with the scent of late summer and the distant rhythmic sound of the lake hitting the shore. The logistics were a marvel of quiet engineering, involving miles of thin nylon fibers braided together to create a flexible canopy that would soon hold the weight of a million tiny dreams. Thousands of volunteers began to arrive in waves, their footsteps echoing softly against the pavement as they moved toward their designated stations with a sense of calm and rhythmic purpose. There was a specialized geometry to the arrangement of the helium tanks, which sat in long, silent rows, like sleeping giants waiting to exhale their buoyant breath into the latex shells. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the sky turned a deep shade of indigo, and the work began in earnest with the repetitive hiss of gas flowing through regulators and the soft snap of wrists tying knots over and over again. The motion was hypnotic and steady, as if the entire city had entered a collective trance of production, where no one spoke above a whisper, and the only melody was a rustle of plastic and the clinking of metal valves. Each volunteer focused on a small sphere in their hands, watching it grow from a limp ribbon of color into a perfect translucent orb that tugged gently at their fingertips, as if eager to join its brothers and sisters under the heavy shadow of the net. The net itself was anchored by thick yellow ropes that stretched upward toward the steel girders of temporary scaffolding, creating a cathedral of tension and shadow that flickered under the amber glow of the streetlights. Imagine the texture of the scene, where the roughness of the concrete met the smoothness of the balloons, and the metallic cold of the tanks met the warmth of human hands working through the midnight hours. There were no sudden movements, only the slow and glacial expansion of the multicolored mass, which began to swell and ripple like a giant undersea creature caught in a gentle current. The logistics of feeding and hydrating such a massive crowd of workers were handled with the same quiet efficiency as cardboard boxes of sandwiches were passed hand to hand in a silent chain of nourishment that kept the energy level consistent and low. The air inside the square became strangely still as the growing mountain of balloons began to act as a sound barrier, muffling the noise of the surrounding city and creating a pocket of absolute tranquility in the center of the urban landscape. Time seemed to stretch and thin like the rubber of the balloons themselves as the clock towers chimed the passing hours in the distance, and the stars turned slowly overhead in their ancient celestial dance. The workers moved in a rhythmic flow of bending and standing and reaching and releasing, their shadows lengthening and shortening against the brick walls of the old department stores that lined the square. It was a labor of infinite patience, where the sheer scale of the task required a total surrender to the present moment and a quiet acceptance of the repetitive nature of the work. The color palette of the night was a muted rainbow of reds and yellows and blues, all softened by the dim light into pastel echoes of their daytime vibrance. Every few minutes a soft ripple would move through the gathered mass as the net was adjusted to accommodate the thousands of new additions pressing upward with a collective force of several tons of lift. The engineers watched the tension gauges with heavy-lidded eyes, ensuring that the balance of pressure remained perfect so that the mesh would not fray or snap under the mounting strain of the helium. It was a delicate dance between gravity and buoyancy performed in the deepest part of the night, when the rest of the world was tucked away in blankets, and the only witnesses were the silent statues of the city founders. The volunteers felt a sense of heavy, eyed peace as they worked their minds drifting into a state of meditative calm, where the only thing that mattered was the next balloon, and the next knot, and next steady breath of gas. The scent of the night changed as the hours grew small, becoming a mixture of cool ozone, and the faint, dusty smell of the latex powder that coated the ground like a fine, colorful snow. As the 3 a.m. mark passed, the square was nearly full, and the mountain of color reached up toward the second-story windows of the nearby buildings, a shivering wall of light that seemed to pulse with life of its own. The logistics of the cleanup had already been planned, with brooms and bins standing ready in the shadows, but for now the focus remained entirely on the filling and the stacking and the securing of the net. The ropes hummed with a low vibration as the wind picked up slightly, causing the entire structure to moan like a distant ship, and see adding another layer to the atmospheric symphony of the night. No. One felt the need to rush because the process had its own internal clock that dictated a steady and unhurried pace leading toward the inevitable dawn. The city of Cleveland seemed to hold its breath as the final thousands of balloons were tucked into the corners of the net, completing the giant puzzle that had been assembled piece by piece over the course of 12 hours. The physical toll on the volunteers was a pleasant ache of heaviness in the limbs that signaled a job well done in A. Readiness for the spectacle to come. As the first light of morning began to bleed into the eastern sky, the square was transformed into a dreamscape of soft edges and glowing surfaces where the reality of the industrial Midwest felt miles away. The net was a masterpiece of logistics, a silent web that held back a tide of color until the moment was exactly right. The workers began to step back, their task completed, and their eyes tracing the outlines of the massive dome they had built together in the dark. The transition from work to waiting was seamless as people found spots on the cool grass or leaned against the stone planters to watch the sky turn from black to gray to a soft pale pink. The silence of the square was a physical weight accompanying blanket that settled over the weary crowd and whispered of the beauty of a shared goal achieved through quiet persistence. The logistics had been a triumph of organization, but the experience had been a triumph of spirit, a long, slow journey through the night that ended in a place of total stillness and expectant grace. As the sun finally crested the horizon, the light caught the top layer of the balloons, turning them into a field of shimmering jewels that seemed to vibrate with the energy of the coming day. The giant net held firm, a silent guardian of the 1.5 million orbs that were now fully inflated and straining for the open air. The scene was a lullaby of color and structure, where every rope and every knot played a vital role in the harmony of the whole. The story of the night was written in the tired smiles of the volunteers and the steady tension of the mesh and the quiet way the helium continued to pull toward the stars even as the morning birds began their song. It was a moment of perfect logistical balance where nothing was out of place, and the world felt ordered and safe and ready for the gentle release of A. 1,000 different dreams into the wide and waiting sky. The city was awake now, but it moved with a soft and sluggish energy, as if it too were reluctant to break the spell of the long and peaceful night that had just passed in the heart of Public Square. The moment had finally arrived under a sky that was turning a soft and dusty shade of morning blue as the great heavy scissors of fate were prepared to release the tethered rainbow from its nylon prison in the heart of Public Square. The atmosphere was thick with a quiet and heavy anticipation that felt like the stillness before a gentle summer rain, where every leaf is motionless and the birds hold their breath in the trees. As the signals were given attention and the giant yellow ropes began to slacken, and with a sound like a soft collective sigh, the massive mesh net was pulled away from the shivering mount of color that had been growing all through the long night. At first the movement was slow and graceful, as if the balloons were hesitant to leave the security of the ground, but then a single surge of helium lifted the entire mass upward in a giant undulating wave of red and yellow and blue and orange. It was not a sudden explosion, but a slow and majestic expansion that looked like a multicolored cloud rising from the very pavement of the city and beginning its slow drift toward the limestone heights of the terminal tower. The tower stood tall and silent, its clock face marking the passage of seconds that seemed to stretch into minutes as a cloud of balloons began to wrap itself around the Gothic architecture of the spire. The visual was breathtaking in its sheer scale, yet it was deeply calming to watch because the motion was so fluid and rhythmic, like the swaying of seaweed in a deep and quiet ocean current. Imagine the millions of tiny spheres bobbing against each other with a soft, rustling sound that was muffled by the vastness of the sky, creating a visual melody that played out against the backdrop of the gray city buildings. The sun caught the edges of the translucent latex, turning the entire cloud into a glowing entity that seemed to radiate its own internal light as it climbed higher and higher into the cooling atmosphere. The Terminal Tower Witch usually dominated the skyline was suddenly partially obscured by this soft and drifting fog of color as the balloons moved in a spiral pattern caught by the gentle updrafts that swirled around the city streets. There was no noise from the crowd, only a deep and resonant silence, as thousands of eyes followed the slow ascent of the mass, which looked like a giant bowl of spilled jewels rolling upward toward the heavens. The colors blended together in a soft blur of pastels as they reached the upper. Stories of the building where the windows reflected the kaleidoscope of light back onto the streets below. It was a moment of total immersion in a dreamscape where the hard lines of the urban environment were softened by the rounded edges of a million floating orbs that moved with the grace of a slow-motion ballet. The cloud began to thin as it reached the top of the tower, spreading out like a colorful veil that draped itself over the city in a gesture of peace and quiet celebration. You could almost feel the weightlessness of the scene as the balloons drifted further and further away from the reach of human hands, becoming small dots of light that sparkled like daytime stars. The sky was no longer a vast empty space, but a canvas filled with a moving masterpiece of light and air that invited the mind to drift along with it into a state of total relaxation and ease. The movement was so steady and so predictable that it acted as a visual lullaby for everyone watching below as the heavy pull of gravity seemed to lose its power for just one beautiful hour in the late summer morning. As the cloud moved beyond the tower and began its journey toward the horizon, it looked like a soft carpet of color being pulled across the ceiling of the world by an invisible hand. The transition from the crowded square to the infinite sky was a lesson in letting go and finding peace in the dispersal things that were once held so tightly under net. The air was cool and crisp at that altitude, and the balloons moved in perfect harmony with the invisible currents of the wind drifting over the rooftops and toward the distant shimmering surface of Lake Erie. The terminal tower remained as a silent witness to the vanishing cloud, its stone walls warmed by the morning sun, while the last few stragglers of balloon release bobbed around its ornate cornices like colorful birds looking for a place to rest. The entire experience was wrapped in a sense of profound stillness that made the world feel small and safe and incredibly quiet, as if the noise of the 20th century had been silenced by a blanket of latex and helium. As the colors faded into the distance and the sky returned to its natural pale blue, the memory of the cloud lingered in the mind like the afterimage of a bright light, providing a sense of comfort and a feeling of deep and restorative calm. The logistics of the event were gone, and the tragedy of the storm was yet to come, but in this specific window of time, there was only the beauty of the rising cloud and the silent majesty of the tower and the slow and rhythmic breathing of a city at peace with itself. The mind can wander through the layers of that multicolored mist, feeling the coolness of the air and the lightness of the ascent, until every thought is as buoyant as a balloon and every worry is as distant as the horizon. The tower is a fixed point in a world of motion, and the balloons are a reminder of the fleeting nature of beauty and the importance of finding stillness in the middle of a grand transition. The story of the cloud is a story of quiet wonder that leads the spirit toward a place of rest where the colors are soft and the movements are slow and the world is draped in a blanket of silent and shimmering light. The light fades gently as the sun climbs higher and the last of the cloud disappears into the blue, leaving behind a sense of clarity and a deep and lasting peace that settles over the heart like the quietest of dreams. Beyond the visual spectacle and the towering heights of the terminal tower, there was a deeper and more rhythmic purpose to the entire gathering, which was rooted in the quiet spirit of community giving and the steady pulse of neighbors helping neighbors through the United Way of Cleveland. The philanthropic intention was like a slow and steady stream of kindness that flowed through the city streets as people from every corner of the region reached into their pockets to sponsor a single balloon or a handful of balloons for just $1 apiece, with the humble goal of raising money for local programs that provided food and shelter and education to those in need. Imagine the thousands of individual transactions occurring in small offices and at kitchen tables and in the lobbies of banks, where paper certificates were exchanged for the promise of a floating orb in the sky. Each dollar represented a small token of hope, a tiny thread in a vast safety net that the city was weaving for itself out of latex and helium and goodwill. The process of fundraising was not loud or flashy, but rather a long and patient accumulation of small gestures that added up to a mountain of support, just as the balloons themselves had been gathered one by one under the mesh net. As the campaign progressed through the summer, the tally boards in the city squares would be updated with slow and deliberate strokes of a marker, showing the progress toward the goal, while the people of Ohio felt a quiet sense of pride in their collective contribution. The programs that would be funded by these sponsorships were the quiet engines of the community, such as the local food banks that sat in cool basements with rows of canned goods waiting to be distributed to families, and the after-school programs where the sound of children laughing was muffled by the heavy brick walls of community centers. There was a sense of profound and steady comfort in knowing that each balloon drifting toward the clouds was a symbol of a meal provided or a bed made warm or a child given a book to read by the soft glow of a bedside lamp. The logistics of the charity were as orderly as a library, with ledgers and lists of names all organized by hand in an era before everything was digital and fast. You can almost hear the soft scratching of pens on paper and the low murmur of volunteers discussing the distribution of funds as the city prepared for its great day of release. The idea was to turn a simple piece of rubber into a catalyst for social change, creating a bridge between the whimsy of a world record and the serious work of supporting the human spirit. As the sun set each night leading up to the event, the people involved would reflect on the quiet power of the dollar and how such a small thing could be transformed into a massive cloud of color that would represent the heart of the city trying its best to be kind. The philanthropy was the silent heartbeat of the Balloon Fest, a steady and calming rhythm that gave the event its soul and its meaning beyond the mere pursuit of a headline. It was about the slow growth of fun that would trickle down into the neighborhoods like a gentle rain, providing nourishment to the roots of the community long after the balloons had landed and the crowds had gone home to their beds. The sponsorships were sold with a sense of gentle optimism, where a grandmother might buy 5 balloons for her grandchildren, or a factory worker might sponsor 10 balloons, as a way of giving back to the city that had provided his livelihood for 30 years. There was no pressure, only a soft invitation to be part of a larger story that was being written in the sky for everyone to see. The connection between the act of giving and the act of floating created a psychological lightness that permeated the atmosphere of Cleveland, making the air feel thinner and more peaceful, as if the burdens of the world were being lifted by the sheer collective will of the citizens. As the money was gathered, it was kept in quiet accounts. That grew with a slow and steady momentum, mirroring the way the balloons were filled in the dark of the night. The focus remained on a long-term impact on the programs that serve the elderly with hot meals delivered on trays, and the shelters that offer a quiet place to rest for those who had nowhere else to go. Every time a person looked up at the sky in the days after they could feel the soft echo of their own generosity, knowing that they had played a small part in a very large and very gentle movement of grace. The beauty of the philanthropy lay in its simplicity and its transparency, where the goal was as clear as the blue horizon, and the method was as light as a breath of air. The city of Cleveland was functioning like a single living organism, with every sponsorship acting as a cell that contributed to the health and the vitality of the whole. It was a boring and beautiful process of administration and counting and planning that required thousands of hours of quiet labor behind the desk and over the telephone. The legacy of these sponsorships was meant to be a legacy of stability and care, ensuring that the social fabric of the city remained strong and resilient against the challenges of the coming years. Even as the balloons were being released and the spectacle was unfolding, the real work was being done in the quiet offices, where the funds were being allocated to the various community centers and clinics that formed the backbone of the region. The story of the charity is a story of a city taking care of its own with a slow and rhythmic persistence that is as steady as the rising of the sun and as calming as the falling of the snow. It is a reminder that the most spectacular things often have the most humble beginnings, and that the true measure of a community is found in the quiet ways it supports the vulnerable and the small. As the mind drifts into sleep, it can find comfort in the thought of these millions of dollars and balloons working together to create a better world, one small gesture at a time. The philanthropy was a lullaby of logistics and love, a song of service that played softly in the roar of the event and left a lasting impression of peace and purpose in the hearts of all who participated. The city sleeps soundly, knowing that its efforts were rooted in a desire to help, and that the spirit of giving is a constant and soothing force that never truly fades away. The colors of the balloons were merely the outward sign of an inner grace that the city had cultivated through months of patient work and dedicated service to a cause greater than any single person. It was a day of soft light and heavy meaning where the act of charity was as natural as breathing and as quiet as the clouds drifting over the lake. The morning began with a deceptive warmth as the golden rays of the sun stretched across the lake, and the thousands of people gathered in the square felt a sense of triumph, watching the rainbow cloud ascend toward the clouds. But far beyond the city limits, over the dark and cool waters of Lake Erie, a subtle and silent change was beginning to take shape in the upper layers of the atmosphere, where the invisible currents of the wind move in ancient and predictable patterns, a massive wall of cold. Air was sliding down from the northern reaches of Canada, moving with a glacial and unhurried persistence that would soon encounter the humid warmth of the Ohio Valley. This shift in weather was not a sudden violent storm of thunder and lightning, but a gradual cooling of the air that changed the very physics of the balloon's journey as they bobbed and drifted higher into the sky. Normally, the sun would continue to warm the helium inside the thin latex shells, causing them to expand and rise until they reached an altitude where they would naturally disperse over hundreds of miles, or eventually pop in the thin, dry air of the upper atmosphere. However, the approaching cold front acted like an invisible ceiling, a heavy and chill blanket that pressed down on the city and began to leach the heat from the balloons as they climbed. As the helium inside the orbs cooled, it began to contract and lose its buoyant force, and the vibrant cloud that looked like it was heading for the stars began to stall and hover in the darkening sky. The atmosphere became dense and heavy with moisture as the temperature dropped several degrees in a matter of minutes, creating a phenomenon known as a temperature inversion, where a layer of warm air is trapped beneath a layer of cold air, effectively pinning the balloons in place over the metropolitan area. The thousands of spectators watching from the ground did not immediately realize that the wind had shifted, but they noticed that the cloud was no longer moving away toward the horizon. Instead, it seemed to be thickening and sinking back toward the earth like a heavy fog made of rubber and gas. The vibrant reds and yellows began to lose their luster as the sky turned a bruised shade of gray, and the cooling air turned the cheerful spectacle into a low-hanging ceiling of debris that hovered just above the tops of the tallest buildings. It was a slow and silent transition as the laws of thermodynamics began to dictate the fate of the 1.5 million balloons, forcing them down into the path of commuters and rescuers and unsuspecting travelers. The wind, which had been a gentle southerly breeze, suddenly turned and began to blow back from the north, bringing with it the damp and chilly breath of the lake, which wrapped around balloons and pulled them toward the surface of the water. The balloons acted like a giant living curtain being drawn across the city, creating a strange and muffled environment where the light was filtered through layers of latex, and the sound of the city was swallowed by the sheer volume of the descending mass. Imagine the quiet descent of 1 million tiny weights, each one losing its struggle against the cooling air and drifting lower and lower until they brushed against the power lines and the rooftops and the surface of the lake. The weather played a trick of timing and geography, catching the city in a moment of vulnerability and turning a record-breaking dream into a logistical nightmare that would linger for days. The physics of the cooling atmosphere were relentless and indifferent to the goals of the organizers as the cold air continued to pour in from the north and solidify the barrier that kept the balloons from scattering into the vastness of the wilderness. The cloud stayed consolidated and thick-moving as a single entity across the landscape instead of spreading out as planned, and this concentration of material was what created the chaos on the ground and on the water. You can almost feel the chill in the air as the dampness settled into the streets and the bright colors of the morning were replaced by the gray and somber tones of impending rain. The balloons were trapped in a cycle of sinking and swirling, caught in the eddies of the cold front like leaves in a slow-moving autumn stream. The city was being engulfed not by a storm of wind, but by a storm of gravity and temperature, where the very air had turned against the lightness of the event and brought it back down to the reality of the earth. The shift was a reminder of the delicate balance between human ambition and the natural world, where a few degrees of temperature can change the outcome of a massive undertaking and turn a triumph into a cautionary tale. The balloons began to carpet the lake in a dense layer of plastic in color, making it impossible for pilots to see the water and for sailors to navigate the waves, while the air remained heavy and still, as if the world were holding its breath in the face of the unexpected turn. The silence of the descending cloud was more haunting than any thunder, because it was a silent and steady return of everything that had been released with such hope only hours before. The cold front moved through the region with a rhythmic and steady pace, pushing the balloons further south and keeping them low to the ground where they would eventually become a permanent part of the story of that fateful day in 1986. The weather is a force of constant change and subtle shifts and on. This day it chose to demonstrate its power through the simple cooling of a million tiny pockets of helium, creating a visual and physical manifestation of the city's hopes returning to ground in a slow and silent rain of color. The mind can drift into the coolness of that air, feeling the shift from warmth to chill, and watching as the balloons lose their lift and begin their long and graceful journey back down toward the streets and the lake, where the story would take its most somber turn. The atmosphere is a vast and quiet place of currents and layers, and as you breathe in the cool air of this memory, you can feel the heaviness of the day and the peaceful descent of the colors as they find their way home to the earth in the quiet of the cooling afternoon. The transition began not with a bang, but with a slow and rhythmic descent as the sky, which had once been a brilliant gallery of floating jewels, began to sag under the weight of the cooling atmosphere, and the millions of latex orbs started to settle over the landscape like a heavy multicolored shroud that muffled the sounds of the city and the lake. Imagine the quiet of snowfall, but instead of white flakes, the air was filled with a dense and slow-moving fog of rubber in every shade imaginable, which drifted down in long, sweeping curves toward the pavement and the rooftops and the vast gray surface of Lake Erie. The beautiful spectacle that had once drawn gasps of wonder was now transforming into a literal blanket of material that began to coat the world in a strange and artificial texture, making familiar streets of Cleveland look like a dreamscape from another dimension, where the ground was soft and the colors were too bright for the darkening afternoon. As the balloons touched, the water they did not pop, but instead floated on the surface in a thick and interlocking carpet that stretched for miles and miles, appearing from a distance like a solid floor candy or a vibrant oil slick that moved with the gentle rolling of the waves. The water of the lake, which usually reflected the moods of the sky, was now completely hidden beneath this layer of latex and helium remnants, creating a silent and eerie stillness that prevented the wind from even rippling the surface. On the city streets, the transition was felt in the way the balloons began to accumulate in the gutters and against the brick walls of the office buildings, filling the alleyways and covering the windshields of parked cars with a soft and persistent pressure that felt both light and overwhelming. You can almost hear the faint, dry sound of millions of balloons brushing against each other, a sound like 1,000 whispers, or the rustle of dry leaves of forest where there is no wind. The city was being wrapped in a layer of history and mistake as the balloons clogged the drainage pipes and draped themselves over the statues in public square, turning the bronze figures into abstract shapes of red and gold and blue. It was a slow-motion transformation where the air became thick and heavy with the scent of rubber and the dampness of the lake, creating an environment that felt insulated and quiet, as if the entire metropolitan area had been tucked under a heavy quilt for a long winter nap. The lakefront was the most dramatic scene of all, where the transition was absolute, and the shoreline disappeared under a mountain of balloons that washed up in the surf, creating a soft and colorful barrier between the land and the water that looked like a shoreline from a fairy tale. Gone wrong. The boats in the harbor were soon surrounded by the drifting mass, their hulls nudging against the soft resistance of the latex, as the owners looked out a horizon that was no longer blue or gray, but chaotic tapestry of artificial hues that seemed to go on forever. The transition was a lesson in the permanence of things that are meant to be fleeting, and as the sun began to set, the long shadows of the city buildings fell across a world that had been fundamentally altered by a single morning of ambition. The blanket of latex was a silent weight that sat upon the city roads, making the asphalt disappear, and the traffic lights look like distant beacons in a colorful fog that never lifted. The mind can drift into the repetitive nature of this scene, watching one balloon land, and then another, and then 10,000 more, until the entire visual field is filled with the soft and rounded shapes of the fallen orbs. There is a deep and meditative boredom in the sheer scale of the coverage as the eyes move across the lake, and see no water, only the endless undulating field of balloons that have found their final resting place on waves. The city feels small and tucked away under this colorful layer, and the rhythm of the descent is like a slow heartbeat that calms the nerves and prepares the body for a long and dreamless sleep. The balloons do not move fast, they only settle and drift and find their way into the corners of the world where they will stay for days to come, creating a memory that is as thick and as heavy as the latex itself. The world is quiet now and the transition is complete, and the city of Cleveland is resting beneath a blanket of a million tiny hopes that have finally returned to Earth to stay for a while in the stillness of the night. The lake was a vast and restless mirror of steel-gray water that afternoon as the heavy clouds began to press down from the north, and the once celebratory sky transformed into a field of obstacles for the men and women of the Coast Guard who were tasked with finding two souls lost in the depths. The search and rescue mission began with a sense of urgent duty, but quickly slowed into a rhythmic and agonizing crawl as the orange and red balloons which had been released in such high spirits began to settle onto the surface of the water in a thick and endless carpet. Imagine the view from the deck of the cutter as it moved slowly through the swells where the natural blue of the water was completely obscured by hundreds of thousands of floating latex spheres that bobbed and dipped with every wave. The most heartbreaking challenge of the afternoon was the specific shade of the orange balloons, which were almost identical in color to the standard life jackets worn by mariners in distress. As the rescue helicopters hovered low over the whitecaps, the pilots' eyes grew weary and strained from scanning the horizon, because every time they spotted a flash of bright neon orange amidst the gray, it turned out to be nothing more than a cluster of balloons tied together by a string. The searchers were caught in a visual paradox, where the very thing meant to symbolize the city's joy had become a veil that hid the tragedy unfolding beneath the surface. The sound of the rotors was a constant low, thrumming that vibrated through the air, but the water itself remained muffled and quiet as the layer of balloons acted like a giant silencer for crashing waves. The Coast Guard crews moved with a heavy and methodical pace, their binoculars held to their faces for hours on end until the world became a blur of orange dots and gray mist. There was a profound and somber stillness in the way the balloons refused to disperse, staying gathered in tight groups that mimicked the shape of a human head, or a floating vest, or a distant buoy. The logistics of the search became a lesson in frustration, as the boats had to push through the soft resistance of the rubber, which hissed against the metal hulls like 1,000 tiny sighs. The families of the missing fishermen stood on the shore watching the horizon with heavy hearts, while the colorful cloud drifted mockingly between them, and their loved ones creating a barrier that was as thick as it was beautiful. The irony of the situation was a weight that everyone felt but no one spoke of as they continued to circle the same square miles of water over and over again in a loop of hope and disappointment. As the daylight began to fade into a dim and watery twilight, the task became even more impossible because the reflections of the city lights began to dance off the wet surfaces of balloons, creating a million false alarms that flickered like candles in the dark. The pilots reported that it was like searching for a needle in a field of needles, where every object they found looked exactly like the object they were seeking yet lacked the life they were desperate to save. The search continued through the night with searchlights cutting through the gloom, but the beams only illuminated more and more the same orange latex bobbing the swells. As far as the eye could see, the rhythm of the waves was steady and slow, carrying the balloons in long undulating lines that looked like a parade of ghosts moving toward the distant horizon where the sky and the water became one. The Coast Guard finally had to admit that the sheer volume of the debris had made their mission a task of chance rather than skill, as the environment had been fundamentally altered by the descent of the 1.5 million orbs. The heart of the city was heavy that night as the news spread that the search was being hindered by the very spectacle they had cheered for just hours before. The memory of those orange balloons remains a quiet and somber note in the history of the lake, a reminder of how the best intentions can sometimes create the most difficult shadows. The searchers eventually returned to the docks, their eyes red from the strain, and their hearts weary from the visual confusion of a world turned orange and gray. The water eventually reclaimed its own, but the image of the floating carpet of balloons stays in the mind like a slow and mournful melody that plays in the silence of the evening. As you listen to the steady rhythm of the search and the quiet lapping of the water against the shore, you can feel the heaviness of the air and the stillness of the night as the city finally closes its eyes and waits for the morning to bring a different kind of light. The balloons are gone now, but the story remains a part of the deep and quiet layers of the lake where the secrets of the past are kept in the cold and the dark. The mind can drift now into that gray mist, finding a place of quiet reflection, where the colors fade away and only the steady pulse of the lake remains to guide you into a deep and peaceful sleep. The interstate highways of northeast Ohio usually hum with a predictable and steady rhythm of tires on asphalt and the low drone of engines moving commuters toward the suburbs, but on that afternoon the air began to thicken with an unexpected and silent rain of colorful spheres that drifted down from the gray clouds like a slow-motion curtain being drawn across the windshields of thousands of cars. As the cold front pushed a massive cloud of balloons back toward the earth, the drivers on the shoreway and Interstate 90 found themselves entering a dreamlike and disorienting fog of red and blue and yellow latex that bobbed and swirled in the wakes of passing semi-trucks. The visual experience was hypnotic and strange, as the balloons did not fall straight down, but danced in the air currents created by the movement of traffic appearing suddenly out of the mist and bouncing softly off hoods and side mirrors with a muffled thud that sounded like a heartbeat. Imagine the sensation of driving through a sea of giant colorful bubbles where the horizon disappears, and the brake lights of the car in front of you become blurred and distant glows behind a shifting wall of rubber and helium. The drivers instinctively slowed down, their foot pressing gently on the pedal, as they peered through the swirling kaleidoscope of colors, trying to distinguish the lines of the road from the undulating carpet of balloons that was now beginning to coat the grassy medians and the shoulders of the highway. It was a series of quiet and slow-motion accidents that began to occur as the balloons blinded the vision of those behind the wheel, causing people to swerve instinctively away from the bright flashes of color, only to find themselves nudging the bumper of the neighbor next to them in a soft and metallic embrace. These fender benders were not loud or violent, but felt more like the gentle bumping of boats in a harbor, as the sheer volume of the balloons created a cushion of sorts that muffled the sounds of the road and turned the commute into a surreal crawl. The police sirens that eventually arrived were also muffled by the dense layer of latex, which seemed to absorb the high-pitched wails and turn them into a low and distant moan that added to the heavy atmosphere of the afternoon. People stepped out of their cars and stood on the shoulder of the highway, their shoes crunching softly on the thousands of balloons that had already landed, creating a sound like walking on dry snow or autumn leaves. They looked up into the sky and saw the source of the chaos still descending in a steady and unhurried stream of vertical river color that seemed to have no end and no beginning. The logistics of clearing the roads became a slow and tedious process, as the balloons would roll and tumble in the wind, making it impossible to sweep them away with a single pass of plow or a broom. The local news helicopters hovered above the traffic jams, their cameras, capturing the bizarre sight of miles of highway covered in a vibrating skin of multicolored dots, while the drivers sat in their seats and watched the world turn into a playground of discarded dreams. There was a meditative quality to the gridlock, as the engine noise faded into the background, and the only thing left was the sight of the wind blowing the balloons in long rhythmic waves. Across the concrete, the metallic center of the road was replaced by the faint and powdery smell of the balloons, which drifted into the air intakes of the cars and filled the cabins with nostalgic aroma of childhood parties and school fairs. The fender benders were cleared one by one with a slow and steady patience as tow trucks moved through the mess with a heavy and lumbering grace, their yellow lights flashing in the dull afternoon light. The sun was hidden behind a thick layer of clouds, but the balloons themselves seemed to hold a ghostly luminescence that made the whole scene feel as if it were taking place underwater or in a distant memory that was slowly fading to gray. The northeastern Ohio landscape, which was usually defined by its steel mills and brick warehouses, was transformed into a soft and abstract painting where the edges of reality were blurred by the presence of 1.5 million tiny distractions. The drivers eventually made it home, their nerves settled by the slow pace of the journey and the quiet beauty of the falling colors, even if their cars bore the small scuffs and scratches of the day's events. The memory of that drive remains a story told in low tones about the day the sky fell down and the roads became a river of rainbows that slowed time to a standstill. The rhythm of the city eventually returned to its normal pulse, but for those few hours a highway was a sanctuary of slow movement and quiet confusion, where the only goal was to navigate the colorful fog and find a way back to the safety of the driveway. The mind can drift now into that slow-moving line of cars, feeling the gentle vibration of the engine, and watching balloons drift past the window in a never-ending parade of soft and silent motion. The world is quiet, and the traffic has stopped, and the only thing left is the steady breathing of the night and the memory of the colors as they settle into the cracks of the pavement and disappear into the darkness. Far out in the quiet, rolling pastures of the Ohio countryside, where the fences are painted a clean, stark white, and the grass grows in thick, deep emerald waves, there sat a peaceful farm dedicated to the breeding of majestic Arabian horses, whose coats shone like polished silk in the morning sun. These creatures were known for their sensitive spirits and their high intelligence, moving with a rhythmic grace that seemed to echo the ancient winds of the desert, even in the heart of the American Midwest. The day began with a silence that was typical for a rural morning, but as the cold front moved in from the lake and the sky began to shift from a pale blue to a heavy bruised violet, the horses felt a change in the air that their human companions could not yet perceive. They paced the perimeter of their paddocks, their hooves making soft rhythmic thuds against the damp earth as they tossed their heads and sniffed the cooling breeze with a sense of rising unease. Then the first of the scouts arrived, not birds or leaves, but small floating orbs of bright latex that drifted down from the clouds like silent alien invaders descending from a different world. At first, it was just a few stray balloons bobbing over the barn roof and snagging on high branches of the oak trees. But soon the sky opened up and a literal rain of color began to descend over the pastures in a dense and terrifying carpet. To the horses, who were used to the natural patterns of rain and snow, this neon shower was something entirely outside of their instinctual understanding as of balloons. Bounced off their backs and swirled around their legs with a soft hissing sound that mimicked the movement of 1,000 tiny predators. The horses began to panic, their eyes wide and rolling, as they saw the ground disappearing beneath a layer of red and yellow and blue that moved and shifted with every gust of wind. They broke into a frantic gallop, their powerful muscles rippling as they tried to outrun the falling sky, but the balloons were everywhere, covering the fences and filling the troughs and draping over the stable doors until the entire farm was transformed into a chaotic dreamscape of artificial color. The expensive Arabian horses, blinded by the sheer volume of the floating debris, began to collide with the very fences meant to keep them safe, their panic cries muffled by the insulating layer of latex that seemed to swallow all sound. It was a heartbreaking and slow-motion tragedy as the owners rushed out into the fields, their boots sinking into the sea of balloons which made a sound like dry, rustling paper under their feet. The horses in their terror leaped at the white railings and tangled themselves in the mesh of the falling net remnants that had drifted miles from the city center, causing injuries to their legs and their spirits that would take months to heal. The scene was surreal and quiet because the balloons acted as a giant muffler, turning the frantic energy of the stampede into a muted and distorted ballet of fear and confusion. The owners tried to call out to their animals, but their voices were lost in the damp, heavy air as the balloons continued to fall in a steady and unhurried stream, covering the barns and the hay mows in a thick, colorful skin. It took hours for the rain of latex to cease, and even then the horses remained huddled in the centers of their stalls, their bodies shivering as they watched the strange, colorful objects roll across the floor in the draft. The farm, which had once been a sanctuary of peace and order, was now a landscape of debris and trauma, where the cost of the city's ambition was measured in the wounds of innocent creatures who could not understand a world of men and their records. The recovery was a slow and meticulous process of hand clearing every single balloon from the pastures to ensure that not a single piece of rubber remained to be eaten or to cause further fright. The horses eventually settled back into their routines, but the memory of the day the sky turned into a shower of plastic remained in the way they would twitch at the sight of a stray leaf or a drifting cloud. The logistics of the insurance claims and the veterinary bills became a long and boring trail of paperwork that stretched into the winter months as the lawyers and the adjusters tried to put a price on the psychological impact on alien rain. The quiet of the farm returned, but it was a different kind of quiet one that carried the weight of a lesson learned about the unintended consequences of even the most colorful dreams. As the mind drifts into the softness of the night, it can imagine the horses finally closing their eyes in the dark of their stalls, the only sound being the rhythmic chewing of hay and the distant rustle of the wind in the trees, where no balloons remain to haunt the shadows. The world is safe and the sky is clear and the animals are resting in a place of total tranquility and peace, where the colors of the earth are natural and the movement of the air are familiar and kind. The story of the farm is a reminder of the need for stewardship and the quiet dignity of the land, which eventually heals itself and returns to a state of grace after the storm has passed and the balloons have all been gathered and taken away. The aftermath of the balloon release was not a sudden roar, but a slow and creeping tide of legal documents and bureaucratic procedures that began to fill the mahogany desks of city attorneys and insurance adjusters across northeast Ohio like a silent paper storm. As the colorful cloud disappeared from the sky, the reality of the situation began to settle in the form of thick manila folders and endless rows of typed depositions that detailed the grievances of those whose lives had been disrupted by the 1.5 million pieces of drifting latex. The transition from a public relations victory to a financial disaster was a gradual and rhythmic process of mounting costs and courtroom hearings that stretched on for years under the dim fluorescent lights of the county courthouse, where the air was always still and smelled faintly of old ink and floor wax. Imagine the long and boring hours spent by paralegals as they sorted through thousands of claims from property owners who found their gutters clogged and their gardens ruined by the colorful debris that had turned into a sticky residue under the autumn rain. The families of the two fishermen who had been lost at the lake filed massive lawsuits, alleging that the rescue efforts were fatally hampered by the visual chaos of the orange balloons, creating a somber and heavy atmosphere in the legal proceedings that cast a long shadow over the United Way and the city of Cleveland. The logistics of these lawsuits were a labyrinth of fine print and technical jargon, where experts testified for hours about the physics of helium and the visibility of life jackets in a sea of rubber orbs. The sound of the courtroom was a steady and hypnotic drone of voices reading from transcripts and the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock as the lawyers debated the liability of charity that had only intended to do good. The farm owner with the injured Arabian horses also brought forth a significant claim for damages, seeking hundreds of thousands of dollars to cover the veterinary bills and the loss of value for the traumatized animals, creating another layer of financial pressure on organizers who had never anticipated such a complex and expensive fallout. Every settlement reached was another withdrawal from the accounts that were supposed to fund community programs, turning the philanthropic treasure chest into a source of legal restitution that drained the resources of the city and left a bitter taste in the mouths of those who had worked so hard to make the event a success. The insurance companies moved with slow and calculated caution, their adjusters visiting the various sites of damage with clipboards in hand and counting the balloons as if they were grains of sand on a very expensive beach. There was no excitement in these meetings, only the dry and repetitive exchange of numbers and the soft shuffling of feet on carpet as the parties moved closer to a resolution that satisfied no one but ended the uncertainty. The news cycle, which had once praised the city for its ambition, now focused on a mounting debt and the irony of a fundraiser that was costing millions more than it ever raised. The public record of these events is a long and winding story of discovery motions and pre-trial conferences that serves as a lullaby of legal exhaustion for anyone who tries to read to the archives. The once vibrant memory of the Balloon Fest was being overwritten by the gray reality of financial statements and the cold logic of liability law until the beauty of the release was almost forgotten under the weight of the litigation. You can feel the heavy stillness of those law offices in the late afternoon where the only light comes from a green-shaded desk lamp, and the only sound is the rhythmic hum of a ventilation system moving air through a building that has seen too many arguments and too few smiles. The city eventually settled the last of the claims, but the financial disaster had already done its work changing the way public events were insured and planned forever, and serving as a quiet warning to any municipality that sought to prioritize a world record over the unpredictable forces of nature and the steady rules of the court. The story of the lawsuits is a story of the morning after, where the colorful dreams are put into boxes and labeled as evidence, and the world returns to its boring and predictable order of balance sheets and fine print. The mind can rest now in the knowledge that the arguments are over and the files are closed, and the city has moved on to a quieter and more cautious era, where the sky is left of birds and the clouds, and the water is left of the waves. The rhythm of the legal system is a slow and steady beat that leads at last to the silence of a finished case, and the peace of a story that has finally reached its end. The gentle lapping of the water against the rocky shores of Lake Erie provides a rhythmic and constant background to a story of ecological awakening that began as the last of the 1.5 million balloons finally settled onto the surface of the vast inland sea. The water, which had seen generations of industry and recovery, became the unintended laboratory for an environmental lesson that would unfold with slow and steady gravity over following months and years. As the balloons drifted into the marshes and quiet inlets, they brought with them a silent and colorful transformation of the natural habitat that the local wildlife had called home for centuries. Imagine the soft rustle of the reeds as the wind pushed the latex fragments into the nesting grounds of the blue heron, and the snowy egret, where the vibrant reds and yellows looked like strange and artificial flowers blooming in the muck. The fish swimming in the cool, dark depths beneath the surface saw the descending shapes as shimmering shadows, and occasionally as mistaken sources of nourishment, creating a slow-motion crisis that the local biologists began to document with a heavy and methodical patience. There was a meditative quality to the way the researchers moved through the wetlands in their flat-bottomed boats, their oars dipping silently into the water as they gathered samples of the debris and noted the locations of the heaviest accumulations. The logistics of the environmental study were as vast as the lake itself, involving hundreds of hours of quiet observation and the cataloging of every single piece of rubber that washed up on the sand. The scent of the lake air, which usually carried the crisp freshness of the open water, was now occasionally tinged with a faint smell of wet latex as the sun began to break down the material into smaller and smaller fragments that moved with the currents toward the distant Niagara River. The ecological impact was not a sudden explosion of damage, but a slow and creeping realization that the things we release into the sky inevitably find their way back to the earth and the water, where they linger far longer than the memory of the celebration. The local environmental policies of the time were a reflection of a different era, but the sight of the lake covered in a multicolored blanket prompted a quiet and persistent shift in the way the city and the state viewed the relationship between public spectacle and the health of the ecosystem. You can almost hear the soft scratching of pens on clipboards as the first drafts of new regulations were written in quiet offices overlooking the water, where the goal was to ensure that such a massive and concentrated release of non-biodegradable material would never happen again. The process of changing the law was a long and rhythmic journey through committee meetings and public hearings where the voices of conservationists were heard in a steady and unhurried stream of testimony that emphasized the delicate balance of the Great Lakes. The birds that frequented the shoreline began to find balloons entangled in their nesting materials, and the sight of a colorful ribbon caught in the branch of a willow tree became a symbol of the unintended consequences of human ambition. The water itself was a silent witness to the change as the mercury in the thermometers rose and fell with the seasons, and the balloons slowly lost their shape and their color, becoming part of the sediment and the stories of the lake floor. The transition to a more conscious and careful approach to environmental management was a legacy of the event that provided a sense of order and protection for the future generations of wildlife and humans alike. The researchers eventually published their findings in thick and boring journals that were filed away in libraries and archives, but the impact of their work was felt in the cleaner shores and the safer waters that followed the implementation of the new policies. There is a deep and restorative peace in the thought of the city learning from its mistakes and moving toward a more harmonious existence with the natural world, where the beauty of the landscape is preserved through quiet vigilance and steady commitment. The mind can drift now into the steady movement of the waves as they wash the last remnants of the past away and leave the sand smooth and clean under the light of a pale and distant moon. The world is quiet and the water is still, and the policy makers have finished their work, leaving behind a legacy of stewardship that protects the lake and all its inhabitants from the whims of the wind and the errors of the past. The rhythm of the lake is a constant and soothing force that reminds us of the endurance of nature and the importance of a slow and thoughtful approach to the world we share. The story of the environmental awakening is a lullaby of science and soul, where the data meets the water, and the result is a deeper and more lasting peace for the earth and the sky. The city of Cleveland now stands as a quiet testament to the passage of time, where the echoes of the mid-'80s have faded into a soft and nostalgic hum that vibrates through the bricks of the old warehouses and the glass of the new skyscrapers. At the center of this urban memory lies the story of Balloon Fest '86, which has evolved into a quintessential piece of Americana representing that unique and repetitive cycle of grand ambition followed by the grounding weight of reality. When people look back at the grainy footage of that September morning, they see a world that felt limitless and a community that believed a million tiny breaths of helium could lift the spirit of an entire region above the rust and the shadows of the industrial past. There is a deep and meditative quality to the way the memory has been preserved in the collective mind of the American public, becoming a cult classic tale that is whispered in the quiet corners of history museums and shared in low tones. Over coffee in the diners that still line the shores of Lake Erie, the image of the multicolored cloud remains frozen in time, a symbol of a moment when high hopes met the physical laws of a cooling atmosphere and the complex logistics of a city trying to find its voice in the silence of the Great Lakes. As the years have turned into decades, the tragedy and the chaos have been softened by the distance of time, turning the event into a gentle parable about the importance of balance and the quiet beauty of small intentional acts over the loud and temporary spectacle of a world record attempt. Imagine the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in a suburban hallway where the children of the volunteers now sit and listen to stories of the day the sky turned into a rainbow and then into a blanket of latex that muffled the city for a weekend. It is a story that belongs to the heartland of America, where the sky is big and the dreams are bigger, but the ground is always there to catch. Everything that falls with a steady and indifferent grace. The legacy of the Balloon Fest is not one of anger or regret, but rather a cautious and somber reflection on the nature of human desire and the unpredictable temperament of the weather, which remains the ultimate architect of our days. The city has moved on building new dreams out of more sustainable materials and finding its strength in the steady pulse of healthcare and technology, but the ghost of the 1.5 million balloon still drifts through the archives of the local newspapers like a slow-moving fog that refuses to dissipate. There's a profound sense of peace in acknowledging the mistakes of the past, because they provide a foundation for the wisdom of the future, and the residents of Ohio carry this story like a worn and comfortable sweater that reminds them of their own resilience and their capacity for wonder even when the outcome is not what was planned. The logistics of the event are now a case study in university classrooms where students analyze the data with heavy eyelids and a rhythmic sense of inquiry, seeking to understand how the best intentions can sometimes lead to the most complicated results. The visual of the terminal tower being engulfed by the cloud is no longer a source of panic, but a visual lullaby that represents the fleeting nature of all human endeavors and the eternal stillness of the stone and the sky. As you drift towards sleep, you can imagine the quiet streets of Cleveland. Today, where the lake breeze is cool and the birds fly without hindrance, and the memory of the balloons is just a soft layer of history buried under the modern pavement. The story is a reminder that we are all part of a larger and more complex ecosystem where every action has a reaction, and every high hope eventually finds its way back to the quiet and steady embrace of the earth. The world is a place of cycles and rhythms where the sun rises and sets, and the balloons of the past are replaced by the stars of the night, which twinkle with a permanent and silent light that requires no helium and no net. The Americana of the 1980s is a world of soft focus and bright colors and heavy hearts, all blending together into a single and soothing narrative that leads the mind away from the noise of the present and into the sanctuary of the past. The city sleeps and the lake is calm, and the legacy of the Balloon Fest is a gentle whisper that says it is okay to dream as long as you are. Prepare to land softly in the grass when the wind changes direction. The silence is a gift, and the history is a teacher, and the story of the Cleveland Saga is finally at rest in the deep and quiet layers of time.